Welcome everybody to the latest episode of Collectively Speaking. This is a podcast series. We're in the second series now, where we sit down with key figures within the built environment, our clients, collaborators and members of the LDN Collective. Today we're going to be talking about a really timely and relevant topic to everybody really, which is about politics and planning, and in particular how that relates to communications and having a good strategy but a good well worked through a process and team helping support these big projects that inevitably are going to be in the public eye. I'm joined today by Jonny Popper, who is the Chief Exec of the LCA. So Jonny, it was a big year for you last year, and I was pretty honoured to come along to a very special dinner to celebrate your 25th anniversary. And that's quite an achievement, and also quite interesting to people because to have been involved right in the thick of it in terms of London's built environment and how that's evolved and developed, particularly the big regeneration projects you've been involved in, like King's Cross and more recently Earl's Court. Can you tell us a bit about, from your perspective, what's changed over those 25 years? I know a lot has, but also what stayed the same and what makes London special, I suppose.
Yeah, you've just started with a nice, easy, simple question. What's changed in 25 years? Obviously, a lot has changed. So, I mean, when we set up the company, so myself and Robert Gordon-Clark back in 1999, there was just the two of us. And obviously, a lot's changed for the business and a lot's changed in planning, in politics and in London, because we're now more than 75 people. Obviously a much bigger company, truly multidisciplinary range of services, but still focused very much on the built environment. So it's been fascinating to watch the whole journey of politics and planning in London. So, I mean, the first thing obviously that changed, we set up to respond to the establishment of a mayor and assembly for London. That was like our business model of a company that specialised in understanding the politics of London, which was changing dramatically. People forget, obviously, you did have the GLC way back when, Ken Livingstone, as we know, abolished under Thatcher. Then you had a period of no centralised government for London and only the boroughs and the City of London. And then in 2000, of course, we had the mayor established. That was a big change for London and took quite a lot of years for the politics to adjust and the politics of the boroughs to adjust. So in the early years, you had quite a lot of battle. So in planning policy terms, for example, you had a real lack of alignment between the borough's local plans and what the mayor wanted to do. Take a really easy example, parking standards. You had Ken coming in wanting to reduce parking provisions in new developments and put the emphasis, understandably, on public transport. And of course, you had outer London boroughs saying, well, no, our policy is two parking spaces for every home. Of course you need that, otherwise how can anyone live? So you'd have a developer completely caught in the middle between what the borough wanted and what the GLA wanted. So that took some time to settle down, and now you have a much, much greater alignment between the London plan and the boroughs, actually. And I think you've also seen a real professionalism of planning across London, across all the boroughs. The political leadership is mostly really good. The chief execs, the heads of planning, and you've got a much better system and process in place than I think we were working with 25 years ago. It's been very interesting to follow that along.
That's interesting you say that, because I suppose looking from the inside out, I absolutely agree. There's much more of a robust sort of process in terms of planning and regeneration and understanding of what good placemaking is, and people that are really world class at what they do. But on the flip side, from the outside looking in, I'm involved in this Land Economics Society, which is a global society, and I know that you've been involved in some of those meetings. Nick Bowes gave us a great a sort of summary of what to expect from the recent changes in government. But when it's the Americans or the Asians, they look and they think they can't believe how long things take for a start.
Yes, that's certainly true.
And but they also kind of can't understand the continually changing nature of the politics and what a big role it plays. Do you think, like looking back at the last 25 years, and you know how that has changed, and people are more aware of you know what it takes to deliver these big projects and small projects? But do you think, can you see things changing now, or do you think there will always be a sort of quite a drawn out process of getting things done? And I'm thinking particularly in terms of all the crises that we're facing in terms of housing crisis and you know, homelessness, and the desperate need to build more homes.
The honest truth is there will always be a drawn out process, but it can be made quicker for a number of schemes. I mean, if you're talking about the very the long term big regeneration projects, of which there are a small number and is not the norm for your normal planning project, they are really complicated to assemble the land, to deal with all the issues you have, to get planning, go through viability, to sign the 106, deal with all your conditions, deal with all the third parties that, you know, then you know, break them up into phases, appoint partners. I mean, that they just inevitably take a long time to deliver. And yes, I think you probably can see the planning system being easier to deliver. We can talk about that, but I think that will continue to take a long time. At a more normal level of scheme, you can definitely speed it up. And I know we're going to talk a bit about some of the government planning reform, but that is absolutely heading in that direction. And I think the key change that we're seeing now, that is the most important single change we can actually see, is just actually the change of attitude that I think will hopefully filter down. You know, there's no question, and I'm not trying to make a political point here, but under the previous government, it is remarkable how unified the entire property industry was in the desperate need for a change at the end of the Tory government. You know, we know, you know, take outside of London that abolish the housing targets, but even more broadly than their planning reform was a throw everything up, start again, frankly pretty nuts idea of zoning the entire country into 3 areas, which would never work in a major urban centre, complex urban centre like London, where you've got different issues street by street, different listed building conservation areas, so many issues at play that need a bespoke response. And we wasted years, frankly, of that. There was thousands of people responded to the consultation. The government quietly shelved it, and then they sort of did nothing on planning reform, or certainly nothing helpful. In fact, they did an awful lot of things that lots of people think were incredibly unhelpful. And then, of course, you had the
secretary, the mandatory housing target,
like removing the mandatory housing targets, like their approach on second staircases. You could argue, and also just politically, how, I mean, you know, had Michael Gove, whose job, he seemed to see his job as attacking the sector, attacking housing associations, attacking developers. It's not really a way of delivering positive change. And of course, you had a lot of playing politics with planning, especially in London, where government will call in schemes that you'd think, why are they calling that in? And there's just politics at play. So we've had the government come in, the new Labour government, and set a very, very different tone. Firstly, they have spoken about housing and infrastructure and public services and the need to get things built from the beginning of their campaign pre-election, which was a very brave thing to do, and which the Conservatives simply abandoned the space, frankly. I mean, at the party conference before the election, Rishi Sunak did not mention housing in his speech a single time, which is quite incredible. And so Labour have come in pledging change, and we've seen quite a number of their proposals, although some of them still not that detailed yet. They've set the right tone, and that tone does filter down politically. I think it's quite interesting in some of their proposals, you know, for example, more things going through officers, slightly less things going through planning committees. I think that's to be welcomed, because we all know, particularly we talked about how professional it is when, you know, they've got very detailed local plans, you've got planning officers and specialists, and they appoint consultants and things to look at stuff. You deal with them, you know, for many months, in some cases many years, spend a fortune getting to a point, but when you get to a planning committee, it can be slightly soul-destroying sometimes, but that'll only be for some schemes, because, you know, the big schemes, you do need something quite important in planning, which is local democracy. So you'll still have a lot of the, you know, the big projects needing to make for there to be a political decision, and that's entirely correct.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's so much in what you were just saying there, and I agree with everything that you said. And it reminds me of when we did the Farrell Review, which was 10 years ago now. We made a number of recommendations around, you know, proactive planning and skilling up planning committees in the first place, as well as, you know, enhancing the role of good officers and the local plans as a framework that should be relied on more, rather than the sort of the whim of politicians, and which can often make things more politicised that don't necessarily need to be. And I fully agree with that. But it's interesting because the other thing you said about it having such a priority now, being, that change of tone and attitude, and that was one of the most remarkable things, I think, about the election last year. But it reminded me also of, there was another 25th anniversary last year, which was of the Richard Rogers-led Urban Task Force.
Yeah.
And actually, if you think back to then, 25 years ago, there's a lot of parallels, because that was led by the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott. And today we have a Deputy Prime Minister leading on the whole housing and construction agenda. And I think you're absolutely right. It's that sort of statement of commitment, of intent, that has a sort of a softer effect on creating conditions of more positivity.
That's right. So that's been a really important step. We do need to have the reality with it, and the reality by which we all know is that there are massive viability challenges. So you cannot overcome fundamental viability challenges merely by change of attitude. And that is the big challenge that we are still facing. Ultimately, what we've seen in planning is more and more policies coming on in every area, more and more requirements on developers. And in a world where you've got massive viability challenges, you're ending up in the situation we're in right now, where lots of things simply doesn't stack up.
Yeah.
So you're either actually just not even going to bother going for planning, or in many cases you do go for planning, but you know you can't deliver it. So you're going to just bank the planning consent, or wait and go back and try and improve it later, or whatever it is you might do.
Yeah.
And we're in right now the perfect storm of as we know, kind of real lack of delivery, particularly on housing.
Yeah.
Less so in some other sectors, and that actually student and build to rent's been pretty good. But we do need to see in my view, a recognition of the viability challenges and understanding that deals need to be done. You can't just, it's not just going to be all easy. Oh, well, if you meet my policy, that's fine. If you don't meet my policy, then don't bother. Yeah. There needs to be, the key word we now need to see is more flexibility. Yeah. And we need to see the Mayor of London adopting that and leading that. We need to see the boroughs leading that, because, officers will understand it. We all know this. You do a viability assessment. It shows what it shows. The borough checks it, agrees with it, or pushes you a little bit, fine. But when you get to the politicians, they simply don't buy it. They just don't believe it. And they're like, well, I don't care that your viability says you can only do 25% affordable housing. Our policy is 35, so it needs to be 35. And there's just this real lack of trust, lack of understanding that's still holding back a lot of schemes at the moment. So I'm hoping that we're going to see more flexibility coming through the system, and the system can deal with it. There are things like review mechanisms where you can review them every couple of years and see if more affordable housing, for example, can be delivered. But we need to see both the change in attitude and the policies that go with it to streamline things, and we need to see a bit more political realism to enable projects to actually be delivered in terms of its viability. And then we'll start to see more delivery, because London is the great resilient city. It's so big. There's always sites that somebody has a great idea to do with. There's always aspirations. It's not going to run out of major developments, of major schemes of what you can do. So yeah, we just but as I say, the attitude that we're seeing so far is encouraging, I would say.
It's often the way, isn't it? With in terms of, obviously viability is a massive issue, but it's interesting that you're talking about the sort of flexibility needed in order to, particularly at this particular moment in time where we have this perfect storm of the cost of construction, the cost of borrowing, and the lack of skills and resources, that in a way something has to give. And do you think, just thinking that through, that the other thing that's changed now as of last year is that for the first time in a long time, that the London government is the same political persuasion as the central government.
And the same as London Council's most boroughs. I mean, we've got this perfect political alignment at local, regional and national right now. Yeah, we've got the perfect window to deliver. So
if those sort of borough leaders that perhaps in the past might have been more intransigent, if they are all part of the same team with Angela Rayner talking about 1.5 million homes, and there's no better place to out deliver on that than in London, that already has all the investment in the infrastructure and the employment opportunities and the need for more people to be housed. Do you think that in itself will enable that sort of movement towards more flexibility, or what do you
Yes,
see?
but the flexibility needs political bravery. You'll have to make just planning decisions that don't comply with policy. So at the same time as saying affordable housing is my top priority, for example, you'll have to agree a consent that delivers less than you would ideally like. Otherwise, the scheme won't happen. So you need to have the political bravery. I mean, it's worth talk about sort of 25 years. And I don't want to give too much of a history lesson, but it's worth just looking back at the history of this in London, because you had Ken come in as the first mayor in 2000, and the property industry at the start were very, very nervous of Red Ken. And of course, Ken basically got everyone in a room and said, I am going to let you build to your heart's content, bigger and taller than you've ever dreamed, but you're going to give me my pound of flesh, and that's affordable housing, broadly. And there were other policies too. And the developer community said, yep, okay. And it was, he was pretty straight with everybody, because, you had across London, frankly, we know very, very soft deals on affordable housing done before the GLA. You had some boroughs who didn't actively want affordable housing in their boroughs, particularly, and so you had a whole shift when the London plan came in, when Ken came in. The first kind of planning decisions team in the GLA was excellent. The first London plan was excellent. It really set the standard. You then had under Boris a lot more flexibility, and of course also partly related to the sort of the 7-8 crash post the financial crisis, and that period where you did have viability issues again, and you had a lot more flexibility on affordable housing. And then you had kind of Sadiq campaigning that it was too flexible, weren't prioritising affordable housing enough. So actually Sadiq came in saying, no, 35%, we need to enforce this. And there was also some justification, I think, for that, and also sending a message through. What they were trying to stop is developers sort of overpaying for a site, and they're coming to the GLA and saying, look at my viability, I can't afford to do affordable housing. Picking on affordable housing, there's other things too, but and of course the GLA wanted to send the message of, well, land values need to be adjusted here. You need to know that you're going to have to deliver 35% before you start, so factor that into your assessments at the very beginning. And so there was trying to have a bit of a fundamental shift on land values and how developers would approach things before they come to the GLA, and that was very successful, I think, at the start. And of course that works as well in a slightly rising market, and we all know the sort of optimism bias that developers have to make these things stack up. But when the circumstances dramatically changed, COVID, interest rates, build costs, global economy, there needs to be an appropriate similar response, and there hasn't been. There's just been a layering of more and more policies, actually more and more requirements, and so that is the period that the flexibility, I think, needs to come in to recognise it. So that's what I'm hoping we'll see now. And particularly, as you say, with that political alignment, because the Mayor of London will now be under great pressure from the Labour government to deliver the housing numbers. So I think to some degree the Mayor's going to have to take a more interventionist approach, which I hope very much he does. And we've seen the early signs. We've seen some positive early signs on that in terms, as I say, the planning reforms and the decisions the government's been making. So yeah, the signs look good.
They do. There's a rare bit of good news coming out of Davos in this meeting of global business leaders. I don't know if you saw, but they did a survey of the 100 CEOs, I think it was, and in terms of what country, what market is the most investable. And actually the UK came second to America and ahead of Germany, China, and that in itself is obviously an interesting sign. And I suppose the timing from that point of view is good, because I know that LCA are heavily involved or a partner with Opportunity London.
That's right, yep.
And I think you were involved in actually coming up with the idea.
Yes, we were. Again, I've got to give Robert the credit rather than myself, but we were one of the original co-founders of that. Yeah. Obviously, working closely with London Partners and the NLA.
So tell us a bit more about that. The idea, sure, I think, is that you have these sort of almost ready-made opportunities for global capital to invest in that tend to be large-scale, mixed-use. But of interest to those sort of capital markets
I mean that's I suppose partly where it's ended up, but the starting point of it was born out of a slight frustration and certainly an identified need that London rarely spoke with one voice, and that if you were an international investor interested in London, where the hell do you go? If you global. There's a great phrase: global capital has a choice of where it chooses to go, both in sector and geographically. And if you were looking at some opportunity in some Chinese city, you can speak to the mayor. I'm obviously greatly oversimplifying, but other cities make this much easier. London, of course, is this massively competitive marketplace. You've got 32 boroughs, you've got the City of London, you've got the Mayor of London, and then you've got individual schemes competing for capital. So it actually becomes quite complicated to know who you approach, how you get there. And this whole point about London with one message, people were taking very different messages to inward investors. So it was first born out of the need to bring together all of the public sector, and then backed by the private sector partners. And the Opportunity London has been very successful. It's backed by London councils, obviously representing all London government, by the Mayor of London, and by Department of Business and Trade, so central government, and they're very involved, DBT. And so you have that full, and the City of London, I should say, as well. So you've got that full backing. And what it's done is, as you say, it's developed the schemes that are investable and ready, and it's raised finance from its partners, and it's funding a global programme to go out and promote London and those schemes. So initially it went out to speak to inward investors around the globe to actually learn what were the challenges that they faced when they were investing into London or considering London. And so we put in place a programme to help achieve that. So there's a big upskilling programme within the boroughs. Effectively, it becomes the single front door to investors, and then it can point them in the direction of either the boroughs or the schemes or whatever it might be that may be the right party to invest in. And as you say, it's got the prospectus where it brings together the oven-ready investable propositions that are public. It then has a list that is private, and then it has a list that you need to send an NDA before it can even talk to you about. So there's kind of the off-market stuff. And I personally was in Hong Kong as part of the Opportunity London delegation just before Christmas, which was brilliant to see that. And I think you're absolutely right. London remains, obviously we very pride ourselves on the number one global city. We every year win the Resonance report on best cities in the world. We have a stable political system, stable legal system, world-leading creative architecture, PR, communication, support services, and of course, as a city that people want to live in with its culture and restaurants and theatres and everything else. And then, of course, geographically straddling, the European markets, kind of America. So, we absolutely remain that magnet, and it's been great to see Opportunity London in action. I think it's been really well received, and it really has hit its strides now in the last 12 months. It's performing its job magnificently, and so I saw that firsthand. And of course, it's now backed by a government. I mean, when I was in Hong Kong, the Department of Business and Trade were saying, so they were under the new government, they've had 2 ministers visit in the space of 3.5 weeks. The last time they had 2 government ministers visit Hong Kong, it was over the space of 3.5 years. And of course, we've seen the Prime Minister out of Saudi Arabia. We know obviously about the visit to China. So we're seeing a very active push across government at the most senior level to promote inward investment, which is, again, a big change in attitude from the previous government.
I mean, that definitely is a welcome change, because London is a global city, isn't it? And it's not competing with Manchester and Liverpool. It's competing with New York and Shanghai and Sydney.
And that's the other great change that we've seen from the government. This kind of, the anti-London agenda is gone, because London is the gateway into Manchester and other regions for a lot of inward investors.
Definitely.
They'll start into London, or they'll look at London, they'll see the other opportunities, as I say, London becomes that showpiece for the UK and its gateway into other regions.
I suppose the thing that we as an industry need to make sure is that with that investment also comes, the spread of opportunity and the infrastructure that is for everybody, for all Londoners, because there is always that scepticism about foreign investment, that actually it's all about moving money around, and for people that wouldn't necessarily come and live here if there's overseas people buying housing. But equally, we need that capital. We need to, it's not going to come all from within our shores.
And there's a difference between the capital that's funding this stuff and then how the schemes get delivered and domestic sales versus foreign sales. So that was definitely a big issue. I agree with you about a lot of the bit housing being built, being sold in the Far East first, for example. I think that's certainly much less of an issue now, and obviously is way less of an issue when you're in build to rent or student accommodation, for example. So or commercial. So that's only affects certain sectors.
And one of those sort of opportunities that Opportunity London is promoting to investors, both UK based and overseas, is a project that we're teaming up with you on in terms of LDN Collective, which is in Royal Albert Dock.
Yep.
And it's a really interesting opportunity because I think it's the only large scale regeneration project in London that is employment led. So there's a real opportunity there, partly because of the scale of the Royal Docks, but also because it's in public ownership. So the land is owned by the GLA, so they can, to a certain degree, control the types of land uses. And I think there's a recognition that in order to keep London's attractiveness on the world stage in terms of things like culture and leisure and health and recreation, is that we can't just keep building sort of residential-led schemes in a piecemeal way. We do need the stuff that actually is all about livability, quality of life, and healthy lifestyles. And it's a difficult one to crack because of the scale and because of the values in East London. But I think for me personally, I think this is the time that the Royal Docks will be where London is heading. And the mayor's moving their office there from London Bridge was a real statement. The Elizabeth line arriving. I mean, I'm always an optimist, but and there's definitely going to be challenges. But tell me a bit about your thoughts about East London, the docks, and the opportunities there.
I think it's a classic example of where the GLA plays a hugely positive role, because you're right, and the Royal Docks itself is massive with multiple different sites, doesn't it? Some of which obviously have already come forward, many of which have come forward. So there's a great example where the GLA can take a role in its kind of oversight and master planning, and then partly try to kind of curate what uses go where. Obviously at Royal Albert Docks, as you say, that's commercial led, which is exactly the right use you'd think at that site. And there's so much that's already happened there. A lot of the transport infrastructure is in GLA's based there. So, and there's a great deal of interest around it. So, I mean, I'm with you. I'm an optimist on this stuff. I think your point about kind of healthy lifestyles, I mean, that goes across development and is much more recognised, and is also now a part of how I talked about the whole professionalism of the whole industry. I mean, if I can nip, it does relate, but to West London. So, I mean, one of the schemes I'm personally very involved in is Earls Court, the Earls Court Development Company. Mm-hmm. That is a master plan that is all about healthy lifestyles. It's 40% unbuilt, so it's only building on 60%, massively prioritising the open space, largely car-free, whole theme around there of the way people will experience the space, healthy lifestyles. And interestingly, that is only 60% residential, it's 40% non-residential. Got a huge commercial element there. Yes. And of course, you've got a site there that is the largest cleared site. It's 40 acres. It's next to 3 tube stations, which is insane. I never thought a site to touch 3 different tube stations, which it does. And a massively important, the classic example of a brownfield land where you can deliver density and high quality. And so that's for me a really good example of a very mixed use schemes, prioritising healthy lifestyles, prioritising open space, mix of commercial and residential, and a very, very clear offer on the commercial for kind of clean and climate tech industries, and a way that, and also the way they've approached their community consultation has been really interesting. Obviously, from our angle, they've taken a really excellent approach of taking years to very patiently engage, basing themselves down on site, really understanding the area, understanding the needs of the area, setting up a community fund 3 years before even getting towards a planning application, let alone a determination. It's just an example of where they've got a lot of things very right. They've taken a very, very long-term approach. They have invested heavily to do that, but I believe that will pay dividends. And I think on something like the Royal Docks, it's similar. I mean, obviously, the difference there is you've got a massive area in multiple ownership, so you need to have the kind of site-by-site approach with the GLA kind of master planning and overseeing it. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that will come forward. And obviously, Royal Albert Dock has already had a bit of a checkered history of failed schemes, as we've seen in different parts of London in the history. But it's a good example of where the GLA plays its role. I mean, if I talk about when Ken came in, I mean, one of the schemes I worked on for a long time was Wembley. Quintain still worked with them at Wembley Park. That would not have happened without the GLA. The old LDA, as it used to be, the London Development Agency, the economic development arm, obviously was then abolished. But the function that the GLA and the LDA performed to help with the land assembly and help with various other issues was absolutely critical to that whole scheme being able to be delivered.
As was the role of Brent Council and being a genuine partnership.
Absolutely.
And I think you're absolutely right. And there's so many lessons to be learned from when we get these things right, aren't there? And whether it's sort of King's Cross and the relationship with Camden and the different developers over the years, and
you talked about how will things get easier. I mean, King's Cross, because obviously we've worked on King's Cross for 24 years, I think, maybe 23. But our longest standing client, and that's a scheme that we followed through. We actually helped Argent, and obviously it's now related Argent. It was then Argent in partnership with St George win the bid to become to become the developer. Then helped them through all their consultation. Then for 2 years it was kind of more construction comms, and then it was into marketing, placemaking, and event PR, and we still work with them today. And of course, everyone quite rightly points to it as the best example of kind of urban regeneration, and rightly says what brilliant developer they are. But people forget that when that, after 7 years of brilliant consultation, talking to everyone, when that went to planning committee, it was still taken to a judicial review by the groups that didn't like it. Now the judicial review failed, but people forget that, that was really difficult. And of course it was across 2 boroughs, part of the sites in Islington as well as it being in Camden. People forget how difficult these things are to actually get through planning, and of course it's very easy when it's built for everyone to turn up and say, "Oh, how wonderful it is." But in fact, we had a similar story at Brent when it went to planning, the Lib Dems, who were then in opposition, voted against it, and then they won the next local election in partnership with the Conservatives, and they were the first to turn up with the ribbon and say how wonderful it is. But that is the politics of these things.
It's never straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about the year ahead and what to look forward to, and obviously one of the in a relatively short space of time, UK Reef in Leeds has become the big industry event. It's overtaken many others. So and the whole industry will be there for a few days, and this year for the first time, London has its own big pavilion, I think, which is actually being built in the dock and floating.
Yeah.
And you're one of the partner.
We're one of the headline partners of that. Yeah.
So can you tell us, because lots of people are interested and wanting to know a bit more about what to expect from that. Can you tell us how that might be different and what London will be showcasing?
Certainly. So I mean, London obviously. Opportunity London has its space for those that go to UK Reef in the Canary. That has jointly with Manchester, but London didn't really have. It's quite a small space, and it's got the outdoor area, which is lovely when it's sunny, and not so lovely when it's raining, as it was last year. So, and London didn't really have a central place actually to kind of bring everything together. So that pavilion, which is double the size of most of the other pavilions, is mostly an event space for its conference program, and we're curating a couple of the events during its time there. So I think it's going to have about 80 seats, and obviously squeezing a lot more people in standing. And then it's also got a very small little exhibition seating area as part of the stand. But it's mainly just a central point, a bit like we're all familiar with at MIPIM. Obviously, it's much bigger than the London stand at MIPIM, but the London stand at MIPIM for years brought everyone together, was the central point. And at a smaller scale, but within the very successful UK Reef event, it's doing that. We were therefore absolutely delighted to partner with it. And it is a very important year for us. So we're celebrating our 25th anniversary. We've formally rebranded to LCA, as we said at the start. And that's also very much a part of recognising that, as I say, with over 70 people, we're a much more diversified business than we were before. And we've talked quite a bit about planning and politics of planning, but the other half of our business is actually the more B2C side, the consumer side. So we don't just get involved in helping navigate schemes through planning and the politics and all the local engagement, which is a very important part of what we do. We also are there to help schemes succeed. So, for example, we were recently appointed by U Capital on Olympia to help launch Olympia this summer into the London market, into the international market, so not the London market. So that's not a planning brief, that's not a politics brief, it's already got planning, it's being built. That's a pure consumer brief. We've got a dedicated social media team, we do an awful lot of paid social influencer engagement. We've got a full in-house graphic design studio that creates all the materials and the websites and the graphics and the social content that we need. And obviously we're a hot PR agency, so we've got all the media skills that we require. So we work on some really interesting briefs that are not just planning and politics.
Amazing. I mean, that's why I was just so pleased to be able to sit down with you today, to be honest, Jonny, because you and Robert and Jane and everyone here, I think, have had such an impact over the years. And actually, it's often sort of behind the scenes and doesn't
Absolutely.
get kind of recognised, or at least people don't really understand all the work that goes into making these things kind of so coherent and actually kind of land well with the communities, the stakeholders. So, as somebody with a background in communications, I fully understand how easy it is to get these things wrong.
Yeah, and of course in comms terms, absolutely, because when there's a failure of communications, that's really public and has a real impact on your ability to deliver. But yeah, I just wanted to add, what you've said about us obviously goes for so much of the built environment. It's such a huge sector, and all of these schemes, you are working with such a huge number of people, from the planning consultants and the architects and the environmental consultants, transport consultants, all these different people that help bring this stuff together. And we've created really strong relationships with our network of associates that we work very closely and collaboratively with, which has been a key part of our success.
That's interesting you say that. We're obviously in the room here with Lawrence from UC Media that does these podcasts, and we've started making films, and we've done it for the Healthy City Design Congress, and we'll be doing another film with UK Reef this year, so we should have a separate chat about that. Make sure we get London sort of front and centre. But one thing Lawrence and I have been talking about and are starting to do is make sure that at the end of each film we have credits like you would have in a Hollywood film, because there's so many people involved in the built environment. It's like the chief grip is often like the quantity surveyor.
That's right.
And more often than not, it's only the architects you ever hear about in these things. And that can't be right, because city making is a broad endeavour.
Yeah.
So, yes, well, Jonny, it's just been a brilliant conversation, and thank you so much, and really looking forward to the next 25 years. And I think, just to go back to my very first question about what's changed and what hasn't changed, I think from my point of view, the thing that hasn't changed and why I think LCA has remained such a successful organisation is the people and the values. And when you come here and you come to the building, even without a reason for coming, that you're going to have interesting conversations with people that you get on with, and that counts for a lot, particularly when you go through these difficult, challenging projects over a period of a number of years.
We're very excited about the year ahead. As I say, we've expanded and invested in the company a lot, taken on some brilliant talent. And you mentioned Nick Bose, for example, who's our MD of Insight, because our insight, our research, our data is very much a core of what we do. I mean, obviously, it's a difficult time right now as we speak. In early 2025, the market's still, we're kind of waiting for that recovery that hopefully will come off the back of a lot of these government initiatives, an economic recovery as well. So we think we're very well positioned for that, and we're very excited about the next few years ahead.
Good stuff, Jonny. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. It's been fun talking.